Chapter 21. My first class on Monday started at 8 a.m., or 8 da manhã in Portuguese. Tiffany had been right about my Sunday. I didn't have much energy to do anything. I had slept in until the middle of the afternoon, hit up the cafeteria for some food, and gotten my stuff unpacked and my VR set up. Then I spent 3 hours catching up with my social media, taking a sunset walk with Tiffany by the Rio Guama River, upon the north bank of which the campus had been built, and getting some dinner. But a mere 5 hours after I woke up, I was putting on my pajamas and crawling into bed again. So it was that I found myself sitting at a desk, trying to hide a yawn and wishing I was still asleep, as the teacher explained what our Intro to Magitech class was going to be about. Starting at the beginning, we'd be learning the basics about standard tech and electricity, followed by Magicus tech and magical fields. Then we work our way into the history of the development of Magitech and how the two types of tech work together to supply a continuous source of power during the transition periods of sunrise and sunset. The second half of the course would be taught after we returned to our own cities and would look at specific types of Magitech devices, including satellites, automobiles, and the underground fusion generators that provided the main source of power for civilization. However, we would have some hands-on experience with different forms of all three types of technology in Belim to see how they each acted in this odd halfway location. One of the students raised a hand during a pause in the teacher's speech. The teacher pointed to the student. "Yes? Are we going to study the twilight magitech that the Yedramor used on Bruchette?" the student asked. The room was deadly silent as people waited for an answer. I'm sure in that moment, it finally began sinking into a lot of students' minds that we were literally next door to Yedramora. Or, as some of the more extreme news would have us believe, the enemy. "We don't know anything about the device that destroyed the building in Bruchette," the teacher replied stoically. "And since no other so-called twilight magitech actually exists, no, we won't be studying the topic." I resisted the urge to mention the theory Aaron had about time travel devices, since they didn't technically exist either. I'd picked a seat in the middle back of the room, where I could see most of the other 40 or so students. In general, they were paying attention to the teacher, but 2 rows forward, I saw one bored student hovering a spinning pencil over his outstretched finger. 2 girls, who appeared to be 19 or 20, kept giggling at the same time about something that was definitely not the teacher's speech, which made me think they were both telepaths. I rolled my eyes and covered my mouth as I yawned again. At the end of class, the teacher assigned chapters 1 and 2 as reading homework, due by our next class on Friday. We each took a textbook from a pile on the table by the door on our way out. It was unusual for us to use printed material, but in this twilight place, you couldn't be certain if you'd be able to access the digital version. I slid the book into my note bag and pulled out my printed schedule to see where I needed to go next. South American literature was split between Mondays and Wednesdays. The building listed was halfway across the campus. Since I hadn't had breakfast that morning, I detoured by the cafeteria on my way there to pick up a drink and a donut. I spotted Rosemary and waved, receiving a head nod in return. When I walked into the room for my essay lit class, to my surprise, I saw Christoph sitting in one of the seats. Not to my surprise, he didn't respond when I said hi. I shrugged it off as him being the same unfriendly guy I had met at the transport and took a seat on the opposite side of the room. There were only a dozen or so students in the small room when the teacher arrived. "Hola!" He greeted us in Portuguese and continued in lightly accented English. "I am Professor Davi Palos. Call me Davi, please. I will be your South American literature teacher. Everyone, please take your bags and follow me." He had been standing in the doorway while he'd spoken, and now he turned and walked out. We looked at each other in confusion for a moment before following the teacher outside. He led us across the center campus green and into the school's library, where we silently made our way to an empty room on the second floor. There were windows on every side, with views over the school courtyard on one side, and the balcony to the first floor of the library opposite that. "This is where we will meet from now on," the teacher told us. "This is where the stories we are going to be reading live, so doesn't it make sense that we are here, too?" He gave us a dazzling smile, and I already knew I liked this odd teacher. Davi handed out sheets of paper with subjects listed on them. No book names or authors, just topics. These are the stories we are going to be talking about in the next 8 weeks. Some you can find in this library, but some you will have to find at either one of the local public libraries or online. Now, go find the first one on the list. A girl raised her hand. All it says is Iara. How are we supposed to find the right book? The teacher grinned. I didn't say find a book. I said find a story. What do you mean? Find a story about Yara, then come back here. I know there are at least 24 books about it in this library alone. Everyone looked at each other, bewildered. Any story? What was Iara? I walked out of the room and found a kiosk that read card catalog next to a search bar. I typed in Iara and instantly received 3 pages of results ranging from history to myth to children's fairy tales to the paranormal. Most of the book thumbnails had a mermaid on them. I scrolled through, wondering where I should pick from. I finally decided on one of the myth books. Mermaids weren't necessarily fantasy, but they'd never been proven to exist either. When I went to grab the book, another one nearby caught my attention, and I picked it up too. It was a different version of the Iara myth, but it had a Portuguese version of the story in it along with the English translation, and I couldn't resist grabbing it as well. The teacher said we had 15 minutes to read our stories when we returned. Then he walked out of the room. I began reading, but the buzz of conversation kept distracting me. Odd, isn't he? That's one way to put it. Who doesn't have an actual list of books to read? A third voice chimed in. I don't know. I think it's kind of neat. Different. From the other side of the table, this should be an easy class. Unless he makes us read all of the books we found, and then write some crazy long report. I hope not. I glanced around and saw Christoph studiously staring at the book he'd picked out. I went back to my story, blocking out the noise of the others, which eventually quieted down as everyone got to their reading. Iara, it turned out, was a lake, or river, mermaid, or nymph, or siren. She had been a Yedramora initially, smart and beautiful, but her jealous brothers had tried to kill her in her sleep. Instead, she killed them in self-defense. The village didn't believe that her brothers had attacked her first and tried to kill her by drowning. The fish liked her, though, so they turned her into a half-human, half-fish, or dolphin, or snake, instead of letting her drown. The exact details of the story differed by telling, which I found out after the teacher arrived and we started discussing what we'd read. Very good. The teacher praised us after we'd spent an hour talking about the different versions of the Iara story. Much of South America's literature is like this. Stories told and retold until they become myths that people don't know the exact origin of. For homework, I'll make it easy this week. Pick any 3 versions of the Iara story. They can be ones we read here or other ones you find somewhere else, and write a 2,000-word essay comparing them. I will give you time to work on it Wednesday, and it will be due by the end of that class. Paper format, please. You can print them downstairs if you want to write it on a computer. With that, we were released. Most of us took the book we'd already found for one of our references. Since I didn't have any more classes for the day and already had 2 sources, I chose to find my last right away. Deciding I needed something besides just myths, I returned to the card catalog and looked for a history book with Iara in it. I found one that chronicled the evolution of the story as opposed to what the story was actually about, then a children's story that showed a very different version of Iara than some of the more adult myths talked about. I decided to get both of them so I'd have some options to choose from for my essay. My student ID worked as a checkout card. I packed the books in my bag and left the library, heading straight to the cafeteria where Tiffany and I had planned to meet up for lunch. Hey, I greeted her outside the building. Sorry I'm later than expected. Had to get some books for an essay due in 2 days. Ouch, she responded. Loading you up fast, aren't they? The essay's not that long, and we have all of next class to write it too. That's good. So, what's on the menu today? She asked nobody in particular as we walked into the lunchroom and checked out the options. That Christoph guy was in my class too, I told her as we loaded up our plates and found a place to sit. Tiffany laughed. Was he any more friendly this time? Nope, I replied. Wouldn't even look at me. Some people, she said enigmatically and shrugged. I know, right? By the time we had finished eating, the sky had decided to fall down on us. I looked out the window despondently. I don't have an umbrella, I complained. Neither do I, Tiffany said. But what's the problem? A little rain never hurt anyone. So, what? We make a run for it? Why not? That's what everyone else is doing, she said, watching as people ran across the yard with bags held over their heads. It's not called the Amazon rainforest for nothing, I commented as we raced across the school grounds to our dorm. Maybe we should look into some umbrellas, she said when we made it back inside. I don't hate the rain, but being wet all the time might get tiring. I nodded. This was just a light rain for now, but I imagined it would rain harder and often. Do you have any other classes today? I asked. Yeah, I have a Latin dance class later this afternoon. You? Not today. I'll probably get started on reading these stories for my lit class and take a nap. I'm still tired. I feel the same, but I'm betting we'll be fine by tomorrow. So I'll see you around? Want to meet up for dinner? I asked. Sure, sometime around 5 sound good? Works for me. After I was back in my room, I realized that I certainly seemed to go out of my way to hang out with Tiffany. I wasn't usually a very social person, but I was alone in a strange land, off chasing my dreams for the first time, and I really wanted something steady to hold on to. I sighed, hoping Tiffany didn't start thinking I was being too clingy. Thinking of being alone, I called up Aaron. It went to voicemail, so I left a message telling him my first classes went fine, and I already had one crazy, in a good way, teacher. I hung up, disappointed, then glanced at the clock and realized he was probably in class. Sighing, I took a seat on the bed. That, along with a nightstand, a dresser, a chair, and a decent-sized desk, composed the entirety of the furniture in the room. The electric overhead light was not as bright as I wished it would be, but the wall-mounted mage lights were also lit up, albeit also dimly, so altogether there was enough illumination in the room to read and write. I watched the lights for a minute, expecting one to go out completely and the other to reach maximum luminosity, but they both stayed exactly where they were. I couldn't decide if it was a benefit or downside to living on the edge of the jungle. I reached over and grabbed my book bag, pulling out the 4 ER stories and setting them on top of my Magitech textbook on my nightstand. Starting with the children's story, I cracked the cover and got to my reading.